Just a heads up, if you are listening perhaps in the car and you've got some little ears around, this episode is an adult conversation. Hi, I'm Mia Friedman and you're listening to No Filter. Antona didn't know a lot about eating disorders. She'd heard about them, sure. As a human rights lawyer and mother of 4, she knew they existed, but she didn't know how they could take someone to the brink of self-destruction and sometimes beyond it. And then one day, her 13-year-old daughter Chloe told her that she wouldn't drink water because she thought it would make her fat. What happened after that almost destroyed Chloe and her family and left them all profoundly changed. Anne has written a book about that time. It's called Cold Vein, and she's passionate about wanting people to understand what anorexia is really like. Here's Antona. Tell me about that Saturday afternoon when you first really realised that your little girl was in trouble.
Oh, look, it was terrifying. My husband was actually away at a father-son bonding camp, so I was in the house with this child that was rapidly getting sicker. And I think up until then I'd probably been in a bit of denial about how serious it was and thinking, well, you know, she'll be fine tomorrow if I can just get her to eat something.
You thought it was maybe a virus. She'd come home from school a few times.
I had a suspicion it might be anorexia at that point, but I really hoped it wouldn't be, and I hoped that it was. I desperately hoped it was something else, or that if it was anorexia, it could be turned around really quickly.
Looking back, what were some of the behavioural changes that you might not have joined the dots around?
I think the secretive eating. So a lot of what she was doing was restricting her food intake. So she wouldn't want to eat dinner with us in the evening. She'd want to go and eat in her room. And there was always an excuse. It was always about having a lot of homework to do, or not feeling all that well, not wanting to eat as much as we were. But I think the thing that really sticks out now is that probably about 2 weeks before that Saturday, we'd been in New Zealand, and she'd actually had a birthday over in New Zealand, and we'd gone out to dinner and we had a birthday cake, and she didn't want to eat any of the birthday cake. And I thought, well, that's really, it's a little bit strange. She's always loved birthday cake, and but she was very stressed about the birthday cake.
It was her 13th birthday.
13th birthday. And I think I tried to rationalise it at the time. Oh, girls are like that, teenage girls are like that. But then looking back, I think that was probably a red flag. And there was another time in New Zealand we all went tobogganing at one of the, the ski slopes. And we all sat in a cafe afterwards having hot chocolate. But she just had a sip of hers and said it was too hot and that it hurt her mouth, and just left it untouched. And again, that was probably a red flag as well in retrospect.
We're of similar age, I think, Gen Xers. Did you know much about eating disorders? Like, were there sort of warning signs, or were you quite literate about that world?
Not really. I, as a teenager, had sort of skirted around an eating disorder. I hadn't had a fully blown eating disorder, but I did know, just from being on the outside of it, what a dark place it could be, and I somehow managed to get out of it before it got really bad. I didn't know, I'd done psychology at university, and that was back in the 70s. And at that time there was a lot of parenting blaming, not so much about anorexia, but about a lot of mental illness. And so my fear, I guess, when she was diagnosed was, well, what had I done as a mother? What had I done to cause this, or what had I not done to prevent it? Of course, I know a lot more about anorexia now, but this is going back 10 years ago when she was diagnosed, and I didn't really know very much.
And on that Saturday afternoon, your husband was away, and what was it that suddenly made the penny drop for you?
I think it was that she just wasn't drinking water. And when I tried to get her to drink water, she said no. And I said, why can't you drink water? And she said, it will make me fat. And it was just the illogicality of it. And
did you try to reason with her?
Of course, I tried all weekend to reason with her, and eventually I rang my sister, who at the time was a nurse, and she said, "Look, if she won't have water, you'll have to get her to casualty." And that was really
she
scary.
went from. I mean, that is so extreme. I was shocked when I read that part in your book about believing water would make her fat, which showed how quickly she deteriorated. Was it a process of months, and that was sort of it happened fast?
It's really hard to say. I mean, maybe the disease had been developing slowly for a number of months and we hadn't been aware of it.
Was she incredibly underweight?
Yeah, very underweight.
Had you seen her? You talked about how she collapsed in the shower and you had to help her back to bed and how shocked you were at what you saw.
Yeah, I guess that was the first time I'd seen her for a while without her clothes because it was winter. And girls at that age, 13-year-old girls, as you would know,
they're very private.
Start to be very private about their bodies, and they don't want their mothers to see them. So that was a shock. I could see then just how much she had deteriorated, and I realised we needed to get help. So it's Saturday afternoon, and I start phoning all of these places that are closed.
Yeah, desperate.
Absolutely desperate. And I think I did phone a psychiatric hospital, but it was for adults, and I didn't think, even as desperate as we were, I didn't believe it was the right place for her to go. So I think then I was focusing on, well, we have to get through till Monday, and then we have to find something for this child. We have to get her into some sort of treatment.
And because she wouldn't even drink?
No, I think once Ray came home from the camp and I had a bit of support and was a bit more calm, we managed to get her to drink some water. But you could see it was a huge effort for her. Her hands were actually shaking. She was terrified of drinking this water.
When someone says, "I'm fat," and you know that not to be true, I imagine you try to say to them, "But you're not." And what would she say? Did you realise very quickly that was a pretty futile argument to be having?
It was absolutely futile because whatever we said, the disease, the voice in her head said the exact opposite. There was no way of reasoning. Logic was just, it was like a plastic sword. It was just no use at all at that stage.
So she was admitted to hospital.
Yeah.
You got her admitted after a very desperate conversation with a receptionist. Can you just talk about that?
So I left her at home with my husband on that Monday. I think we realised she couldn't be left on her own. And I went into work. I had a meeting. I had to pretend to be normal in the meeting. And
you're a human rights lawyer.
Yeah. So I just started that job, and I hadn't told anyone at work about what was going on, and trying to sort of put on this front of being in control. And I had this conversation with. I tried a few places to get appointments, and no one could see her. And I eventually rang an adolescent physician that she'd been. We had a referral to this physician, and the receptionist said, "No, well, she won't be able to see her for a few weeks." And I completely lost it and started crying and said, "Look, she won't be here in 6 weeks." And that was, that was just a cry from the heart. I didn't intend to say that, but I knew it in every fibre of my being. I knew it to be true, and I was absolutely desperate. And so something about my desperation twigged. And so she went and spoke to the physician, and the physician organised an appointment for us with a doctor at the hospital the very next day.
And she was diagnosed and admitted straight away?
Next day.
That was shocking to me, reading that, the speed. Because you kind of think, and I consider myself as someone who knows a lot about eating disorders, it happens over years or at least months. But it literally became a life and death situation almost overnight.
Well, yes, the doctor explained to us at the time that as the disease takes hold, they sort of, they go along on a sort of even keel for a while, and then boom, it's down in this huge dip, and it's life or death. It can be very, very dangerous.
What happened to her in hospital over those 3 months that she was there?
Look, they tube fed her. she was initially on bed rest. She very slowly, she got out of that critical stage, but it took a long time for her to start putting on any weight. And there were rewards for putting on weight in that you could go out for an afternoon with your family. They called it a gate pass. But it was a very sad time. It was, I'm sure that all of the medical professionals were doing everything they could and they were all doing their best. But for us, it was just a desperately sad time because she'd never been away from home before.
She was only 13.
13.
3 months away from home at 13.
Yeah.
And was she resistant to the treatment, or she accepted that she needed help?
Really hard to say because she just wasn't logical at all. And I remember driving her to the hospital on the day that she was admitted, and she twigged that, she might have to stay there. And she started to cry, and I said, "Oh, don't worry, hospitals aren't so bad and we'll come and visit you." And she said, "That's not why I'm worried about going to hospital." And I said, "Why are you worried?" She said, "They'll make me eat." So her whole fear the whole time in hospital was that she was putting on weight and that she was being made to eat. And, unfortunately, I think that she did learn a lot of things there about how to cheat the system.
I've heard that about eating
it's just
disorder.
Inevitable. Yeah.
Hospitals and clinics where they do learn a lot of tips and tricks.
Yeah. It's really, look, it's very hard they have to be in hospital, if you're that sick.
It's life and death.
Yeah. But then there are triggers in the outside world as well. So there's a lot of sites on the internet, pro-Anna sites now, that weren't so much in existence then. But she could be, just as equally learning those things from those sites as she was in hospital.
You had 3 other children at home.
Yes.
And a husband.
Yeah.
Tell me about the impact during that critical time on the family.
The period she was in hospital was a really difficult period because we were constantly having to go to the hospital. I would go one day, my husband would go the next day. And so all of our attention was really focused on Chloe. The other kids, I think, just were really bewildered. They didn't understand why she had to be in there for so long and why she wasn't getting better and why, when they went to see her, she was just so different and wouldn't talk to them.
She's your second eldest?
Yes, that's right.
At that time, how old were the kids?
Her older brother was 14, Ryan. Alice was 10 and Jack was just a little boy. He was only 8. Yeah.
How did you explain it to them?
Really difficult because we didn't understand it very much ourselves. So I think I just said, look, she's stopped eating and that's made her really sick and she has to be there so that she can get well again. And they would say things like, well, why can't she just eat? Why is it so hard? Why can't she come home? Why can't you come to my school assembly? Why are you crying? And it was terribly stressful for us because for a long time we just couldn't see any improvement.
Did she gain weight while she was in the hospital?
Enough to be discharged.
Mm-hmm.
But when she came home, it was actually even worse because she was still really very sick in terms of her mental state. We hadn't really been warned that part of anorexia is feeling often quite suicidal when you're that sick, and it was really shocking to us. She really at times didn't want to be alive, and this was a 13-year-old who'd up until then been the most joyful, the most happy child that you could imagine. Was
it voices in her head telling her not to eat?
Yeah, that's how I understand it.
I don't want to simplify it too much, but your son had a beautiful metaphor.
Yeah. So Jack, who was only 8 at the time, but he used to say, look, it's like she's got a devil on her shoulder that whispers into her ear and takes over her mouth.
Wow, that's incredibly astute.
Yeah, and he's always been very astute, and he could always connect with her, the part of her that was still his big sister that he loved.
Did she detach from the whole family during this time?
Yeah, I think she felt. She must have felt terrible. I don't know how she felt. That's her story to tell, not mine. But I think if you're that sick and you can see the impact it's having on your family, it must make you feel 10 times worse.
So when you've got someone in your house with an eating disorder, it's very different to any other kind of addiction, isn't it? Because an alcoholic just has to stop drinking. Someone who's addicted to cigarettes has to stop smoking. A gambler has to stop gambling. You can't stop eating. And you can't quarantine yourself from food. It's
everywhere.
A battle you have to fight multiple times a day.
Yeah.
How did you manage that? I mean, were you given instructions on this is what she's got to eat at every meal?
We were given a meal plan that had quite a lot of flexibility in it, so it wasn't a very rigid. She must eat this meal and this quantity. And we were given support from the hospital. We had outpatient appointments once a week with a very nice, very good therapist. But the actual coalface of anorexia is those 6 meals a day where you're there with the sufferer and you're there while you just have to wait until they eat. And obviously you can't force feed them, but you have to persevere with the message, look, you must eat this, we're not going anywhere till you eat this. And some of the meals would just go on for hours.
Talk me through how a meal would work.
Okay. So there'd be a lot of tension with the preparation of the meal. So there would be a huge argument usually about what the meal was going to be. And
when would you have that argument? Like, say, breakfast as soon as she woke up?
Pretty much. Yeah, or it even might start the night before. I'm not having muesli tomorrow for breakfast. I won't eat that.
So what would you say?
Just try and rationalise and say, look, this is what we've been told you have to have. We will wait until you have it. We won't go to work until you've had it. If you won't have this, you'll have to come to work with me, so that I can make sure that you eat your morning tea. So we'd all sort of be sitting there, we'd all finish what we were eating, and then she would not finish, or she would just take a lot longer than everyone else.
So would she literally push her food around the plate?
Yeah.
She'd sit there.
Yeah.
Would she become distressed?
We'd all become distressed. Someone would always end up in tears, and eventually the other kids just stopped coming to meals because it was just too difficult. So they'd go and eat in front of the TV, and it would just be Ray and I sitting there sometimes for hours.
And what would you do during those hours? Would it be a process of talking to her or just waiting it out?
Both, really. So talking, trying to be encouraging, saying, look, we love you, we're doing this because we love you and we don't want you to get sicker, and it's really important that you eat this and you can eat this, and just tell that voice in your head to, just get stuffed. But, you can't do that day in, day out
6
without
times a day.
Occasionally losing it. And so I'm quite open and honest in my book. I wasn't perfect as a mother of, someone with anorexia, and I made big mistakes.
What are some of the mistakes you think you made?
Well, I think really becoming this sort of warrior woman and trying to force calories into her to win this battle and to beat this anorexia. And I think in retrospect that was probably too much of a harsh approach. And I think my husband and I had very different approaches. He was much more conciliatory, he was much more gentle, so that we were often fighting about what should happen, and obviously that made the tension and the conflict 100 times worse.
You write about your son would close the windows.
Yeah. Our house that we lived in then was sort of in a bush area, and we had a lot of doors that opened onto decks and a lot of big windows that opened onto the bush. But every time there was a meal, he would start running around to close all of those windows and doors because he didn't want our misery to be heard.
The tears and the shouting and the... How did you come out as a family dealing with anorexia to your friends and your workmates? Because was it something that you, I imagine, dealt with in private for a long time, but at what point did it become something that you had to start talking about?
Well, at work it came out pretty quickly because there was the day that we took her to the hospital, and I think because I hadn't come into work and I'd been so stressed I hadn't even rung work, my boss rang me on my mobile and I just completely broke down. Said, look, we're in the hospital, my daughter's got anorexia. And they were just fantastic from the outset. You know, human rights law practice, how could they not be otherwise? Yeah. But they weren't at all judgmental, and there was a lot of support in terms of, you know, getting time off and doing everything they could to support me. Close friends and family knew pretty quickly. People we didn't know so well got to find out more slowly, I guess. And when we told people, it was really difficult because it was almost as if their faces would sort of close down, and they, at the time I thought, well, they're judging us as bad parents. But now I think that they actually didn't know what to say. There wasn't as much known about anorexia 10 years ago as there is now, and one of the really good things with my book is that people have said to me that they've bought the book to better understand what their friend is going through who's got a daughter with anorexia.
I was going to say, is it different to, like, if your daughter or your son is diagnosed with autism or, you know, breaks a leg or gets an illness or a condition, something like anorexia, do you feel like you're being judged? I mean, you talked a little bit when you wrote in the book about you feeling that it's your fault. Is it that unspoken belief that people think that, oh, she did something wrong? What did she do? Did she put her on a diet?
I felt judged on a number of, well, I felt judged, you know, fairly or unfairly, but I think people
also... That's just being a mother, isn't it?
Yeah, it's part of being a mother. But I think people also judged her to some extent. Well, why aren't you better now? You know,
why can't you just eat?
And a few people over the years have talked about anorexics as being, you know, naughty and why are they putting their parents through this?
Or attention seeking.
Or a lifestyle choice or that type of thing. And people just couldn't understand either why it took so long to get well. So my husband's workplace, I think a few comments were made. Well, is she still sick? Hasn't she been in hospital? Why, you know, why isn't she better? Why are you still having to take time off work? And there was that judgment, I think, too. Well, what are you doing to not get rid of this? To, you know,
try harder, family,
get rid of this problem. Yeah.
More with Anne in a moment, but first, a message from our sponsors this week. She did recover for a little while, didn't she? Or she improved. Tell me about those years between 13 and 16 when she relapsed.
Yeah, so there were a couple of years where everything seemed to be normal again, and she seemed to be at a normal weight. She was having periods again for a while. She'd settled really well into a new school. She had friends, and we actually really thought that the nightmare was behind us.
Was that something that happened slowly?
Very slowly.
But one day you woke up and you weren't fighting over what she was having for breakfast anymore.
Yeah. I remember taking her into the hospital for a sort of final checkup, and they checked her, you know, her blood, her weight and her symptoms, and said, look, you know, she's really good now, and you've done a great job. And
well done.
Yeah, well done. And I remember I dropped her off at school and drove across the Harbour Bridge, and it was almost like I could punch the sky. I was thinking, great, we're over this. But then I just took my eye off the ball, I think, and when the stress of the school certificate, which they had to do in those days, started, and she started to, maybe become a little stressed about that. I'm not quite sure what the trigger was the second time.
And she hasn't been able to tell you?
No, she has said, though, that she never thinks it really went away. She never thinks that she really learnt the tools that she needed to manage the illness. so that she was always very vulnerable. And maybe part of her mind was still, very much stuck in the anorexia.
So it was just really dormant.
Yeah,
it wasn't
exactly,
gone.
Dormant. Mm.
So she was doing her school certificate, and when did alarm bells go off for you again?
She started to tell me she was feeling sick at school. I think there was a night she actually phoned me. So her bedroom was on the other side of the house to ours, and she phoned me in the middle of the night and said, look, I'm really sick, but I don't think I can get up to go and be sick. Can you bring a bowl? And so I got up and I went to her room, and, it was winter again, and she'd been very much covered up in big, thick, heavy clothes. But then I could see that she had lost a lot of weight. And then I think the next day we weighed her, and it was just like the bottom fell out of the world again. I could see just how sick she was. It was a terrible feeling.
How did you, as a mother, manage your own reaction in front of her?
I tried to hide my shock and my fear most of the time, but not always. I mean, you just become so terrified you can't help but become slightly hysterical sometimes and say, look at what you're, please eat something because you're so sick and I'm so worried about you.
Did it deteriorate quickly after that again?
It did, yeah, it did. And we tried it was her idea to try the family-based therapy again. We really thought that would work. We didn't want her to go to hospital. But
how does family-based therapy work?
Well, that's what I talked about before, which is what we did after the period in hospital, where you sit around and you encourage the person to eat.
So it's not therapy in terms of with a professional?
Yeah, we had outpatient. So
Right.
you normally have some sort of family therapist guiding you through the process.
And then you keep doing it yourself?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's when you say family-based therapy, it's not the family going to see a therapist, it's the family being the therapist.
Pretty
Is that
much,
right?
Yeah. So the treatment is in the home with the family.
You're given the
Support,
tools
yeah.
to... I see.
Yeah, so supporting the sufferer to eat. I mean, from a economic point of view, I guess it makes a lot of sense because you're not having to, the health system's not having to fund intensive treatment.
Who pays for this? All of it? The hospital, the psychologists, who pays for it all? The medical appointments?
Well, interestingly, the treatments that we were trying then were partly funded by Medicare and partly funded by a health fund. But we were still out of pocket quite a bit because of the intensity of the treatment.
And what about working? You and your husband, the amount of
Yeah.
time you had to take off work?
Well, I had to quit my job. I had to become a full-time carer because she got to the point where she just couldn't be left alone. It was 24/7. And I knew that it was life or death again. And really at that point there was no hospital in those days that could take her. She was too old then for the children's hospital. The alternative would have been an adult psychiatric hospital. But look, I knew from some of the cases I'd done about some of the things that can go wrong. And I just didn't, I had to be absolutely convinced that she would be monitored really closely. And the only way that could happen would be, me watching her.
Before you quit your job, you used to take her to work sometimes, didn't you?
My husband and I would, just take turns. So she'd have morning tea with one of us, afternoon tea with the other. But it was the only way that we could ensure that, she basically ate enough to stay alive.
And then she was still at school and you had to go to school and sit with her at recess and lunch.
Yeah.
How was the school and how did that go?
The school were really good at making that happen, and they allowed it to happen in a very discreet way so that, it wasn't us marching into the playground and taking her away from her friends, which would have just been mortifying. School provided, the only element of normality and connection that she had at that point, so we thought it was important to keep her in school. But the school provided us with a private little room where I would go and wait and she would come and, we'd eventually get through the sandwich or whatever it was that day. But it was
you must have had
incredibly
to have the
difficult.
patience of a saint.
I didn't have the patience of a saint. And that's, I part of my book,
Shame on you.
I hadn't read any books that really spoke about this honestly from the parents' point of view.
Felt. I mean, I guess many parents know that build up of sort of rage and frustration, even if your child's sick and they say they won't take water or they won't eat their medicine. And they're like, no, I'm going to vomit. I won't have my medicine. And that rage and desperation, it's born of desperation that rises in you. It's like, you've got to take your medicine.
Yeah. It's incredibly difficult. There was one book actually that helped me, and I don't know if you've heard of Bronte Cullis and her book Bronte's Story, and there was that wonderful
Ray Martin story.
Yeah. So early on in her book, there's a diary that her father, I think, wrote about what it was like to live day by day with Bronte when she was really sick. And he writes about losing it and, throwing food. And I remember that made me feel so much better at the time that someone else owned up to not being a perfect parent in control.
Well, I mean, Anne, it must be such an extraordinary level of inexplicable frustration, because it's like if you have a child that's sick, you would do anything to cure them. Like, if they've got cancer, they get chemo. But if you have a child that's sick and they're refusing to do what will cure them, which is eating food, I mean, it's not that won't cure them, but keep them alive essentially, that must be an incredibly hard thing to process.
Yeah, and we were both lawyers, my husband and I, and our jobs were about taking people's problems and fixing them up. And usually after, no matter how difficult a problem was, you could find some sort of solution. But with anorexia for so long, we just couldn't find a solution.
Tell me about the moment when she bottomed out.
Yeah.
We're not going to go into too many details, but talk about it as much as you can.
Well, it was a day where I think we were pretty much at desperation point because she hadn't been responding to the treatment we were using at home. I'd given up work to help her recover, and it just seemed to be absolutely everything was falling apart. And I got it into my head that we had to be tougher on this disease. We had to be really tough, and we had to get her to eat hard things. And if that was, too hard, well, that was too bad. We just had to do it. It was actually like trench warfare. So I made her eat something that she really didn't want to eat. And there was a terrible argument. And then I just had a feeling things weren't right with her, and I went and checked on her and found her very close to taking her own life. Yeah. You
talk about you were cradling her in your arms, and what did she say to you?
She said she was counting backwards from 10, and she was at 3. Yeah, it was incredibly close, and I think that I actually don't remember that moment very well. I think I've blocked it out. I think we all have.
You write that you were on your way down the stairs, but something in you there was something about the silence in the house. Yeah. You write so beautifully about that. The mother's intuition just drove you, and you ended up knocking her door down.
Yeah, exactly. It was just a really strong feeling, and I think the feeling I had many times was that even at its most desperate, there was something somewhere helping. It's a very hard thing to explain, but I'm not, a particularly religious person or anything, but I did feel at times that there was just something in the universe there that would pull us out of this eventually. We just had to keep going and have faith.
The book opens with you on a plane with Chloe on the way to Sweden.
That's right. To
the Mandometer Clinic?
Yes.
How did you hear about this program?
Quite by chance. It hadn't been mentioned to us by any of the medical professionals that we dealt with. Jack was seeing a reading teacher because he had some problems with reading, and she twigged that he wasn't his usual happy little self, and she said, "What's wrong with him?" And it wasn't long after the suicide attempt, and I just told her, and she said, "Look, you really should speak to this friend of mine who's come back from this clinic in Sweden, and her daughter had something really similar, and now she's going really well." And I think I rang that friend pretty quickly, maybe the next day, and we had a bit of a chat, and then we met for coffee, and a lot of what she said about her daughter was very similar to Chloe. And it just provided me with, it was a revelation, because I could see that, well, there's a different way of looking at this disease, and there's a different type of treatment.
How is it different to what you'd experienced?
Well, the focus was not so much on what to eat and refeeding, but it was on how to eat. So their take on it was that eating disorder sufferers have essentially forgotten how to eat properly. It's their behaviour, their eating behaviour, that's gone off the rails. And they have to learn to reconnect with feelings of hunger, reconnect with feelings of being full. They have to learn to eat their food without restrictive habits. They have to learn basic things like eating in cafes, eating in restaurants, sitting at a table with other people. These are all things that get really, stuffed up with anorexia. So that was interesting. I also liked the way they focused on trying to do something about the obsessive exercise, because that was a very big part of her anorexia.
Where did she exercise, or what exercise?
Look, a lot of it we probably didn't see. We've only found out about it since. But
on the plane you talked about finding out.
Yeah, absolutely.
She went into the bathroom and just ran on the spot on the way to the clinic.
Yeah, and that's part of the, the obsessive behaviour that's set off by enforced malnutrition and brain changes. And I think we sort of were understanding at that point, well, she can't stop this and she needs help. And so the idea that they had of thermal treatment and warming patients who were, very anxious after having a big meal, that made a lot of sense to us, and it seemed very nurturing as well.
So tell me about that. How did it work?
Well, when she got to the clinic in Sweden, after she had a meal, the idea was that they had all of these warm rooms, they called them. So they were just little cabin rooms, really, like little cocoons, where you would go and they'd have the room heated to a particular temperature. And with that temperature and that feeling of warmth, it's very hard to feel anxious, and most of the time you end up just relaxing or going to sleep. In fact, the first time I went into one with her, I slept, and they had to wake me up. They thought it was hilarious that mothers are putting mothers to sleep.
Did you stay with her the whole time she was in the clinic?
It was a bit of a tag team thing with my husband. The whole period we were over there was about 5 months, so I think I stayed initially for 2 months. Then he came over and stayed for a month. He basically just worked from the little apartment that we were living in near the hospital.
Did you ever worry that there would be that effective contagion with your other children?
Yeah.
And them learning or having their own eating habits disrupted?
Yeah, look, that is something that can happen, and I've spoken to parents in other families where that has happened, and it's hard to know how much is contagion and how much is genetic, because a lot of the research that's coming out now is showing that anorexia has very much a genetic basis, so that it can run in families. But yeah, I certainly did worry about that, and it was really good in many ways, even though it was terrible to break the family up. But it was really good to have the eating disorder out of the house. And the other kids all said, we miss you, we miss Chloe, but we're really glad there's no more fighting about meals. And Jack said, I'm really glad I'm getting attention.
Spoken like a true youngest child. You called the condition, you write in the book very powerfully about needing to separate the condition from your daughter.
Yeah.
And the name of the book is Cold Vein, based on what you decided to call the disease.
It was actually her name for it. So one of the psychologists that she had got her in one of the sessions to name the two things in the world that she hated the most. And she's always hated being cold. She's very much a, summer child. She's always hated winter. So cold was a word that she thought of. And also veins. She's always had that phobia, I think it's venophobia, where if people think of veins or blood tests, they faint.
Oh, God.
So she came up with the name Cold Vein, and that gave us this monster, this entity to fight against. But in a really scary way, and this was only pointed out to me by someone who read a very early draft of my book. She was giving me feedback on the book, and she said, well, Anne, do you realise what cold vein means? And think about it, if a vein's cold, it's not working, it's actually death. And that really sent a shiver up my spine, because most of the time she was really sick, it did feel as though we had this thing in the house that was trying to kill her. That's how it felt as a parent.
So who paid for the clinic? How expensive was it?
Oh, look, it was incredibly expensive, and at the time there was a fund called a Special Purposes Fund, which our health fund actually had for treatments that weren't available in Australia. So in the days before we left to go to Stockholm, I did an application to this fund and got lots of medical evidence to show that we tried all of these treatments and none of them had worked. And it took a long time for us to get an answer from the fund, but just before Christmas an email came through to say that they'd approved our application. So that was, I can't remember the exact amount, but it was, I think, close to maybe $120,000, which covered...
And around how much of that did it cover?
Hard to say. I think it probably covered most of it, but on top of that there was the expense of accommodation, and then because her treatment took longer, we ended up getting a top-up from the fund. So it's an incredibly expensive treatment.
That's out of reach of most people.
Absolutely, but it shouldn't be. And it just astounds me that there is still no funding for this treatment in Australia. I write in the book about a doctor that we went to in the early days who charged us $300 and, did the absolutely most stupid thing you can possibly do with someone with anorexia, which is ask them what their BMI is. And then say, well, I've got patients with much lower BMIs than that. You're not that sick.
Oh, no.
And so if we'd wanted to keep going to that doctor, Medicare would have paid, a proportion of those fees. If that doctor had put her in a hospital program that he was connected with, our health fund would have paid. But this treatment that we tried that's been successful, not just for us, but for many other Australian patients, gets absolutely no funding from Medicare. I think maybe there's one or two health funds that might provide funding. So I really don't understand that.
You write in the book that this the Mandometer clinic and treatment program has only a 10% relapse rate, and most anorexia treatments have a 50% relapse rate.
Yeah, I'm not too sure what the statistics are now. I looked at their website this morning and I think they still talk about the 10% relapse rate.
And they don't have any clinics in Australia?
They have an outpatient clinic in Melbourne, and that was incredibly helpful when we came back to Australia because they could monitor her, not every week, but every month or so, and that ensured that she didn't relapse. So she's never relapsed after we've had this treatment, and she's gone on to be, having a completely normal, happy, healthy life.
Tell me about Chloe now. How old is she?
She's 27 now, and I write in the book about, a dream I had. in the really dark days when we only just started in the clinic in Sweden, and at that time she was very sick. But in the dream I had this image of her as an adult or a young woman, and she was dressed up as a professional woman, and she had her hair up in a bun, and she had lots of lovely, her face was warm and glowing, and her eyes were really alive. And that's how she is now.
Wow.
Yeah, that's exactly how she is now, and she's very happy. She's got a good job. She's travelled. She's got a lovely man in her life, and she's really happy.
When you came back from Sweden again, was it slow?
In terms of how do you
progress? Was there a moment where you went, "Oh my God, it's behind us"?
Oh, okay. Look, it's a series of moments, really. Just as the development of anorexia is a series of moments, the recovery is a series of moments. So some of those moments were small things. So you'd catch her actually licking her plate, but just going back and scraping extra food off the plate. We went towards the end of the treatment, we went to an Italian restaurant, and the waiter was this middle-aged Italian man, and he started flirting with her and calling her Miss Beautiful Eyes. And I realised then that it was her eyes that had changed. That she was back. There was a person there again. And when she'd been really sick, her eyes were just really, just dead, very inward-looking, and devoid of a lot of expression. And I think other things were we could all sit down and have, from pretty much day one when she came home, we could all sit down and have a meal together at the table. There wasn't that, fighting anymore about food. I guess, there were times we worried she might relapse, because then she had to do the higher school certificate and cope with the stress of the last couple of years of school. But we always had the backup of the clinic in Melbourne if we had a question, if we were worried about anything. And I guess I can't really think of a moment where I thought it was all behind us. It's just a series of moments.
Do you still find yourself thinking, watching what she eat, if you're out to dinner and watching what she orders, or I imagine that's after a decade, that's behaviour that's hard for you to unlearn as well.
Well, Mia, I think the writing of the book has helped me stop doing that.
Yeah.
I guess, I process things very much by writing about them. I don't talk about them. I'm a bit of an introvert, so I process things by writing. And I think writing the book, having it published by Finch, and having people respond to it, I feel it's all in the past, so I don't worry anymore. So it's like a cathartic experience.
Did it take a long time to put the family back together?
It was, I would say we were all pretty traumatised. And while we all stuck together and, we were supportive, I think probably the next year was a little bit rocky in terms of, the other kids. They didn't really react and say, well, you didn't give us enough attention or anything, but they had to be really confident this wasn't going to happen again. So their anxiety, I think, we needed to work really hard to convince them that we were actually through this and that everything was going to be okay. And I think it's actually made them, when you have tough times like this and the wheels really fall off everything, you can become much more compassionate in your approach to life and resilient. And I think most of the kids have said since that, while they wouldn't ever want to go through that experience again, that they think it's made us closer as a family.
they're close to their sister again.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you have a family member who you think might be suffering from an eating disorder, or if you're suffering from some symptoms or an eating disorder that you're concerned about, you can find help at the Butterfly Foundation by calling 1800 33 4673 or finding them online. There are lots and lots of resources that can help. Please buy Anne's book, Cold Vein, at apple.co/mamamia. And that's where you can buy and see all the books of all the amazing people that we've interviewed on the show. Scroll back in your feed and you can hear so many more amazing conversations with amazing people. If you have a story that you would like us to tell or to help you tell, or if you have heard a story of someone that you think we should interview, please call the pod phone and leave us a message on 02 8999 9386, or you can email us at podcast@mamamia.com.au. The producer of No Filter is Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll see you on the homepage, mamamia.com.au.